Hi students, this is Unit 2, Note 6, the Indian Removal Act. For Note 6, you should find that on page 15 of your packet. You will need a blue colored pencil or pen or whatever for this handout, okay? You've got 2 important vocabulary words, 3 important people, and a summary of the Trail of Tears to fill out today. So have a little flashback to 6th grade Minnesota studies. What is this painting showing? If you take a look at this painting, you will notice that there are white men dressed as, um, in their suits and formal wear. See an American flag flying behind them. And you will see Native Americans primarily on the right hand side. And you'll see the traditional teepee behind them. And they're shaking hands. You can also see that some are signing some papers where they're signing treaties to be able to keep their land. Okay, this is one of the pictures from the Treaty of Traverse de Sioux that you might remember from 6th grade. Okay. We continue to talk about Andrew Jackson's presidency, and one of the things that occurred during this time was the Indian Removal Act. The U.S. government had been making treaties with Native American tribes since we had gotten our independence from Britain. Typical treaties promised Indians payments of food, supplies, and money in exchange for giving up their old lands. They were moved to new lands that they were told would be theirs forever. Despite the treaties, American Indians continued to be pushed off their lands further west. So the Indian Removal Act was a law that was passed by Congress in 1830, and it allowed the U.S. government to make treaties with American Indian tribes who voluntarily agreed. Indian Removal Act allowed the U.S. government to make treaties with Indian tribes on a volunteer basis. They were not supposed to be able to force Indian tribes to sign treaties. Remember, a treaty is a peace agreement between two different parties. Andrew Jackson had been a frontier settler. He had little sympathy for American Indians who felt the white settlers were pushing them off their lands. During Jackson's presidency, it became part of the national policy to remove natives by force, if necessary, to give American settlers more room. By the time Jackson was president, only 125,000 Indians lived east of the Mississippi River. Jackson was determined to remove the remaining tribes further west. So Andrew Jackson continues to be an important person in this section because he is the president who signed the Indian Removal Act into law, and he was determined to move the Indians west of the Mississippi River. Please fill in your timeline on page 2 of your packet. For some of you, you may need to pause it here and fill in 1803 and 1812 as well. 1830 is the one written in red today. That's the new one. 1830 is when Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. So in your last quiz, you had 1803, which was the Louisiana Purchase. You had 1812, which is the War of 1812 against Britain. And now we have 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. The Trail of Tears. The Cherokee Indians were living peacefully in their ancestral lands that spread from South Carolina across Georgia and Alabama and up into Tennessee and Kentucky. They had worked to coexist with settlers and even adapted to many European methods of farming and living. When a small amount of gold was discovered on Cherokee land, settlers wanted the land for themselves to look for more mineral wealth. John Ross was the chief of the Cherokee tribe. The Cherokee had adopted a democracy with their own constitution for their government. They elected Chief Ross to lead the sovereign Cherokee nation. Sovereign means independent. If the U.S. government was going to make a treaty with the Cherokee for their lands, they would need Chief John Ross to participate. Most of the Cherokee did not favor trading their lands east of the Mississippi River. So most of the Cherokee Indians did not want to move, even though the settlers wanted them to move because they found gold on their land. So the U.S. government wants to make a treaty with Cherokee to have them voluntarily move to the other side of the Mississippi River. And they need Chief John Ross, who is the leader of the Cherokee Indians. Samuel A. Worcester was a missionary and translator to the Cherokee who helped fight and defend the sovereignty of the Cherokee Nation. He was arrested and convicted for disobeying Georgia's law, restricting white missionaries from living in Cherokee land. His appeal went to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1832. Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall established that the United States must treat Indian nations as sovereign or independent nations. This meant that the Indian Removal Act, passed by Congress in 1830, was unconstitutional. So, the official Supreme Court ruling is that the Cherokee have an independent nation, as does all the other Indian nations. Okay, they're all independent. And so the Removal Act was something that was completely unconstitutional. They can't just move these Indian nations. President Jackson refused to enforce the Supreme Court's ruling. He sent representatives to try again to make a treaty with the Cherokee. John Ross met with the officials, but he walked away from the treaty, knowing it was not what his people wanted. Instead, now remember, John Ross is the leader of the Cherokee. So the U.S. representatives continued to negotiate with Cherokee Major John Ridge and a couple of other Cherokee men. And they signed the Treaty of New Echota, which exchanged the Cherokee lands east of the Mississippi River to the U.S. in exchange for $5 million and land in Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma. Chief Ross was not at the signing of the treaty. So, the treaty was supposed to be made by John Ross and the U.S. government. John Ross walked away from the table and refused, so the U.S. government went on to talk to other Cherokee people who then signed the treaty without Chief John Ross's or the Cherokee people's approval. That's ugly. Chief John Ross and many others petitioned Congress to reject the Treaty of New Echota because John Ridge and the others who signed the treaty were not leaders of the Cherokee. But President Jackson had what he wanted: a treaty signed by Cherokee giving up their eastern lands. Even after Jackson's term as president was over, President Martin Van Buren carried out the terms of the treaty. Over 17,000 Cherokee were rounded up and forced to leave their homelands. The Trail of Tears is the forced removal of the Cherokee Indians from Georgia to Indian Territory, west of the Mississippi River in 1838. So they pushed them out of Georgia, across the Mississippi River, to the area that's just above Texas in Oklahoma. The Trail of Tears, or in Cherokee, the trail where they cried, was over 2,000 miles and crossed 9 states. Some Cherokee were taken en routes by water, others walked on foot. U.S. General Winfield Scott and 7,000 soldiers escorted the Cherokee. It was a harsh and difficult journey. Those who could not keep up were left to die. Of the 17,000 Cherokee who were forced on the journey, roughly 4,000 died before reaching Indian Territory. So, using your blue colored pencil or pen at this time, please trace the Cherokee's Trail of Tears. After the Cherokee arrived in the new territory, Major John Ridge was assassinated by men from Chief Ross's group, who felt Ridge had sold out the Cherokee people. So, in summary, at the bottom of your packet, in 1838, federal soldiers were sent to enforce the Treaty of New Echota. More than 17,000 Cherokees were forced from their homes and made to march west in the winter to Indian Territory, which was in Oklahoma. 4,000 of these Indians died on the journey.
The forests are cleared. 5 acres of family a year. In 1800, 23 million acres of Indiana is wilderness. In 60 years, it's tamed, flat, fertile farmland. But there is more than forest to clear.
It's always been one of the deep flaws of the American imagination that it can't imagine a future for American Indian people. As Americans, American Indian people have to imagine that for themselves. And that's the hard part.
Keep walking. 1830. Frontier President Andrew Jackson declares a new policy. A policy that America will maintain for more than 100 years. The forced relocation of American tribal people onto reservations. After years of Supreme Court battles, the bill passes Congress by a single vote. Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, Seminole, Cherokee, all forced off their nations by the point of a bayonet. An episode in the conquest of the West that even some of the soldiers taking part find shameful. U.S. Army Private John G. Burnett writes,
"The sufferings of the Cherokee were awful. The trail of the exiles was a trail of death. They slept in the wagons and on the ground without fire. I saw as many as 20 die in a single night of pneumonia, cold, exposure."
Move along. march of 1,000 miles becomes a trail of tears.
It's a shameful act in American history, and it's in its own way sort of an iconic act because it really symbolizes what happened to the Native Americans.
In concluding, here's a picture. I saw the helpless Cherokees arrested and dragged from their homes and driven at the bayonet point into the stockades. And in the chill of a drizzling rain on an October morning, I saw them loaded like cattle or sheep into 645 wagons and started toward the west. And that concludes your notes for the Trail of Tears.